Good afternoon or good morning. Welcome to today's webinar, 5 images, 5 processes. One of my actually favorite formats just because we get to play around with images and see what you can do. If this is your first webinar and you don't know who you're listening to, actually we'll just turn on webcam as well. My name's David. I'm part of the software sales team based out of Copenhagen in Denmark. And as usual, we have 60 minutes today to run through. We might not use all of it. We shall see how we go. We are recording as well, so don't feel you have to remember every single thing that we go through. You can always watch the recording at a later date. You're very welcome and encouraged to submit your questions at any time. If you look on the bottom of your GoToWebinar control panel, you'll see the last section is called questions. If you put a question in there, that will come straight through to me. Equally, if you're on your Android or iOS device, you can tap the question mark icon and ask a question in the same way. When you leave, hopefully not before the end. Whoops, too far. When you leave, hopefully not before the end, please answer the exit survey, just so we know that we are ticking all the right boxes for you guys and girls. All right, so let us begin. So let's just move this out the way and get that right out the way as well. I am going to turn the webcam off at some point just so we can focus on Capture One. What we're going to do today is that if we just come to the collection of all the images, we've got a number of images to run through. So try to pick a variety. We've got a headshot, we've got a landscape, food shot, street, and then like a simple editorial, just so we can cover, a few different techniques and things. So let us get started. So I'm going to turn the webcam off for the minute, and then if I need to explain something, I will come back on as well. Alrighty. Okay, so let's start with our... So I've got to peer over my microphone to see my keyboard. So let's start with this one, which is a landscape from photographer Fabienne Bazenegu. Fantastic name. Now this is quite a good one to run through just because it's a little bit flat from the outset. And we can easily make it into something like this without too much messing around. Oh, Alan says cursor. Goodness, Alan, that's good that you are here to remind me. Otherwise, I would have forgotten. So you may see the cursor, like so, every now and then. So that would just help you to locate it. Thank you for the reminder, Alan. All right, so the first one. Now, with an image like this, before I do anything else, personally, I tend to try and crop it. So we can either choose crop tool up here or hit C on your keyboard. And then I'm going to throw on a crop something like this, as I just want a hard stop on the road down there. And then H on my keyboard just to get me back to the hand tool. So before anything else, before we get involved in color edits and all that kind of stuff, if we look at our levels, we can see that it's pretty underexposed, or at least a little bit, just because there's not much information going on here in the right hand side. So if I just bring up the exposure a bit, probably to around something like that, that will just sit my histogram a bit nicer in the middle. Maybe a little bit less. And then also we're missing some information on either side of the level, so it doesn't make any sense to have that. So we just bring those in to match the ends. And then if I want to darken the midtones a bit, we can do like so. So really, all we've done now is tweak levels and exposure, and that's it really. And that kind of, you could almost stop there if you wanted to. That makes a pretty good improvement. If I option click on my reset button up the top, alt click, like so, you can see before and after. So two tools, quite a nice edit. So it's a little bit hazy, so let's just put some clarity in overall and a bit of structure, which just helps our sharpness. Now there's a bit of exposure differentiation from the top to the bottom, so kind of will make sense. I mean, it's not blown out or anything like that. It just would kind of make sense if we can equalize that exposure a little bit. So if we go over here to the levels tool, let's grab our radial gradient mask. So which is improved in Capture One. So if not radial, my mistake. Don't want a radial, I want a linear gradient mask. Silly me. So now if I click drag, holding my shift key, that will keep that perfectly horizontal. And if I press, says he, let's just tweak that. Let go of shift too soon. And if we press M on the keyboard, we can see how that gradient mask looks. Now, as this can be asymmetric, if I hold my Alt key down, like so, I can then bring this up just so it makes the gradient, say, a little bit harder on that side, because I don't really need any exposure change in the bottom area. So Alt drag that bottom line up, and then that works better. Okay, so now let's just bring that exposure down a tiny bit. We could actually do the same thing with the levels on this area, like so. If we wanted to get rid of the slight blue tint, I guess, we could go to the blue channels of my levels tool, and we could just bring that in a tiny bit as well. And that kind of corrects for that color if you don't want it. Of course, you might want that tint, yeah. Oh, if the image is jumping, that's sometimes GoToWebinar gets a bit confused. I am working with them just to see if we can resolve it. It's nothing that Iris was asking that's wrong on your end or my end. It's just the way it transforms. But in the recording, it will be clear as a whistle. So don't worry about that. Okay, so we could, if you like, correct for that blue tint if you wanted, just easily in the levels as well. And also on this layer, if we wanted to, we could bump up the clarity further, and that will dehaze it even more. But I think the haze in this shot, it's kind of, it's part of that image really. So I don't want to get rid of it too much. Now, last thing to do, I might just rotate a little bit. So if I click into my rotation and flip box and just shift cursor down, then I can just make a little tiny tweak like so. Now the last thing is, this is actually a bit distracting. So we've got like a gate to a fire road or something like that, which we don't really need to see in this. So we can easily get rid of something like that. So if we go to our layers tool and we say new heel layer. So a heel layer will basically allow us to take one part of the image from the other and then drop it on. So I'm going to grab my draw mask brush, or B on your keyboard, and we want to get rid of this spot. But first of all, I need to pick a source. So where do I want to borrow a bit of image from? So I'm going to grab here. So Alt key again and click. See, now I get a spot, and then I'm just going to mask over this bit, probably around here will do. And then if I need to move my source point, I can just jiggle that around a bit. And then if I deselect, turn off my mask, you can see it's covered that up quite nicely. So now that just gets rid of that distraction. So Leon was asking what's the difference between clone and heal. Well, this is the bit that we got rid of. I mean, you could spend a bit more time if you wanted and clean that up, but to be honest, I don't think you'd notice that. So what heal does, and you can see it over here, heal basically matches the luminosity better on the bit you're trying to replace, so it will blend in better. If I change this to clone, it'll just be a like for like copy. So you see it went a little bit darker, and if I go to heal, then it lightens up again, like so. So heal will try and match the luminosity better. So generally heal is the one to use unless you physically want to copy one bit of the image from somewhere else. Is clarity a dehaze slider? Not really, but it's kind of, doing that to some extent. I think there's a lot of myths about a dehaze slider, but remember, when you see something hazy, it's just normally like a lack of contrast. So we can improve that with the levels tool. We can bump up the clarity because that's a good mid-tone adjustment as well. I mean, if you totally wanted to dehaze that completely, then we could actually just heap in more clarity. But it's always going to have a little bit of haze there as well. Oh, someone with keen eyes. Philip, there's a dust bunny up here. There is. So let's just grab our spot tool. And we're going to say dust. Grab this. Might be a little bit too big. And just plop it there. And that should get rid of that nicely as well. It's a little bit visible still, but we can try spot. And that does a better job. Dust is generally used for dust that's on the sensor. Spot is for a blemish that's on the subject itself, like a spot on a face or something like that. Alrighty, I think I would stop there with that one. So if I hold my Alt key down again and click on reset, then you can see that was before and that was after, like so. And we didn't do a great deal, but it's a big improvement to the image. So that was a nice, easy one to start with. So next, let's look at our editorial shot, like so. So it's a little bit, again, like the last one, it's a little bit on the dark side. I don't think we've got any other edits on here. It's all pretty empty other than a tweak of white balance, I think. So let's just bump up the exposure a bit. We can see histogram's not quite right. So if we just increase exposure a little bit, probably to something around there, then we can almost say that's pretty nice out of camera actually. Let's just bring in the levels ever so slightly. But what would be nice to do is just do a little bit of dodging and burning or selective lightening and darkening. So in this case, I might just want to brighten up the face a little bit, maybe the shirt, but I don't want to boost up the overall exposure anymore because it's pretty good for the image itself. So I'm going to make a new layer and I'm going to double click on it and call it lighten. You could just call it L for short. That's what I do. I just use L and D, and then I'm going to bump up the exposure by a couple of thirds of a stop, something like that. Now I want to brush this in. I need to wave around my hands a bit, so I'm just going to turn the camera back on for a second. Hopefully you can see the camera. Let's just check. Should be able to see me. Yep, you can. So what flow does, because this is something we're going to need to use, if I right click, you can see we've got this flow slider control down here. So when flow is at 100, so I set my exposure correction to plus 0.8. So with flow at 100, if I draw on the image, that's going to lay down that whole adjustment in one hit. So it's just going to be 0.8 in one brushstroke. So that could be too much. It might be a bit too aggressive. So if you reduce flow, so let's say I took flow down to whatever, 4 or 5%, it is a percentage, then every time I move the pen back and forth, it's going to be building up in 5% increments. So that will allow you to build up that adjustments nice and slowly. It will give you a much more natural result than just splatting in the adjustment, if you like, in one go. So nice low flow, good for this kind of thing. Let's turn that off again. Okay, so we got our brush like so. I'm going to make it a bit smaller and nice and soft. And then all I need to do with my low flow is just brush gently back and forth like so, and that will gradually build up my adjustment. I could do a bit on the shirt as well. And you might think, well, nothing's happening. We could do a bit more. We could put some hair highlights in like so. But if we turn off the layer, so if we disable the layer, you can see before and after. So just lifts it a little tiny bit, simple as that. Now, if we want to do the opposite, I can make a new layer. Let's call that darken, like so. And sorry, I'm just closing something that's bonging in the background. There we go. We can call that darken, and I'll go the other way. So let's just drop this down by a couple of thirds. Grab my brush, nice low flow, and then if we want to put any shadows sort of back into the image, Zoom in a little bit. Just to paint in some modeling or whatever, then we can do so as well. So again, if I turn this off and then back on, off, sorry, the image jumps a bit with that, and back on, then we can see the difference. If I option click on the reset button, then that will show no layers, and then with our layers, like so. So it's a simple thing to do. Obviously, you could spend a bit more time, but it's really easy just to do that basic dodging and burning. Question from, where are we? Any difference between creating an empty layer, inverting it, versus creating a filled layer? No. And you'll see that later, Raphael, on the next image. So I can explain a bit better what that means. I've been using Lightroom for 8 or 9 years. That's Dennis. I learned a lot by watching recordings, but I still haven't quite wrapped my head around the levels adjustments with the two handles. It's dead easy, really. So if we just bring out the levels tool, actually, let's go to this guy and let's just make it's actually a really good question, and it's worth spending a bit of time. So levels, let's just bump up my exposure. Basically, let's just camera on again. So you've got 0 to 255. So 0 is black, 255 is white. The bottom figures, so that's these ones down here, and you have the top figures. So basically, if I bring out the histogram and stick them together, what we want is a histogram that spreads all the way across the range nicely, ideally. Okay. So let's just pop that down a bit. So we want the histogram to start here and finish at the highlights. So you'll see as I bring the shadow in, you see the shadow start to creep that way, because we're saying, hey, Capture One, map this value 17 to 0. So stretch it out to meet 0. And same here, 255. If I start moving this across, we start to stretch out our histogram. So we're saying map 212 to 255. So if you imagine that histogram is like a bendy elastic thing, you're just pulling on the edges to get it to 0 to 255. Now, the reason why there's two handles at the top is then we might want to say, okay, let's limit my brightest white to 247. So if you're printing, sometimes you don't want to have something completely blown out. So then that will place an upper limit on the brightest white in the image. So now we're saying map 212 to 247. So now Capture One will try and keep that constraint to 247. But that's all you're doing. But generally, for most of us, let's reset that. You can either just hit A for auto, works pretty good if you don't want to get involved in it, or you can just bring in the shadows and highlights to the edge. And the middle, Vincenzo, who was asking, is midtones. Do you want to make midtones darker, or do you want to make midtones brighter? And you see the histogram gets shoved all the way to one side or the other. So when you're setting the levels, you can just use that to moderate your midtones as well. And that's all there is to it. It's pretty simple, really. But if you don't want to get involved in that, just hit A for auto and you'll probably be pretty happy. Okay, webcam off. And let's go. What was next? What was next? Next. We did Camilla. Oops, let's close that. So we did Camilla, and we're gonna now go for a street shot like so. Now this image I think is pretty unadjusted. Let's just check. Yeah, let's just reset. So there's nothing going on with this image. It's total straight out of camera. You could actually almost consider this done, to be honest. So good job by Emily, the photographer. So let's bump up the white balance a little bit. Oh, I need to reset my workspace. Hang on. I lost some tools. There we go. So the only thing, I think it's a little bit warm for me. So let's just drop the white balance down a touch to something like that. So that's a good start. I'm going to hit C for crop on my keyboard and just crop a little bit of the exterior environment around. Not too much though, because that's what kind of makes the shot. So maybe just a little bit on the right hand side, like so. So that's my crop. Next thing to do is, I'm just trying to remember what I did yesterday. I can never manage to do the same image the same way twice. I think on the background layer, a little bit of overall clarity. Remember, clarity is a contrast adjustment, but it only affects the midtones. Now his face, like the last shot, is just a little bit too dark, so I'm going to use the same trick. So new layer, I'll call it L for lighten, too lazy to type lighten. Bump up the exposure a bit, grab a brush, and let's just lighten him up a little bit. What's my flow doing? Maybe a bit too low. So let's just lighten him ever so slightly. We can check what's happened just by turning the layer off and on. So it's only a tiny bit, but it just lifts the exposure ever so slightly if you're fussy about that. If you went too far, don't forget, rather than going to try and erase what you've done, just drop the opacity down a bit and then you can moderate it quite nicely. Now the next part is that I want to focus on the central subjects a bit. So this would be a good case for a radial mask. So we could vignette, but vignette only gives you that shape around the corners, whereas we kind of want an oval shape. So let's make a new layer and we're going to call this Radial. And we use our new for Capture 112 radial mask, which is this guy here, or T on your keyboard, you can see as a shortcut. And I'm going to start drawing, and then this gives us our radial mask, as you can see. If I press M, you can see what it does like so. So that gives us our radial mask. Now that's not really in the right place right now. So I will rotate it a little bit just by grabbing the middle handle and then making it softer. So those three lines that you can see, you've basically got the outer line is 100%, the middle is 50, and the center is 0. So that's kind of how your fall off is going to be, like so. So I'm pretty happy with that radial mask. I might just move it a little bit. Incidentally, if you want to draw an inverse radial mask, you can grab the outside line, so down here, and then you can flip it over the middle, and then you'll get that inverted radial mask. So now most of us are probably drawing radial masks like this, but if you always want to draw them inverted, you can right click and say draw mask inside. But that will make it a default. Okay, so M to hide and show the mask. So I'm just going to drop the exposure down a bit just to darken the outer edges. Now, if I want to, I can always retrospectively change that radial mask. If my cursor tool is still on the radial mask, I can just go back onto the image and give it a little tweak. So I think that's better. So I'm happy with that. So the next thing to do, I think, will be a little trick with the Luma mask. So Raphael was asking earlier, is there any difference between adding a layer and right clicking and inverting it to simply adding a new filled layer? And there's no difference. So you might say, well, what's the point of adding a new filled layer? And a filled layer is basically a layer which affects the entire image. So I pressed M on my keyboard so you can see how the mask looks. So that's going to affect the entire image. And you might think, well, what's the point? Because I could just do that on the background layer. Well, for what I'm going to do on this layer, it makes perfect sense. But it also can make sense for color grading as well, because it separates out those different jobs. But for this layer, what I want to do is to do a luminosity mask, because I would just want to isolate the darkest blacks. So if I click on Luma Range here, we can then apply a constraint on that mask. So if I hadn't made a mask and I'd press Luma Range, nothing would happen because we don't have a mask to modify. So we have to have some kind of mask first. So if I click on Luma Range, straight away what's going to happen is that I can pull these handles at the top to only mask certain parts of the image. So right now it's pretty much covering all of it, but if I drag it slowly down, you can see that ever so slowly as I'm going, we start to remove the mask to only this part of the image. So I'm just going to really try and isolate just the deepest shadows like so. So you can see where it's in red, just the parts I'm going to mask. I'm just going to apply that, and to maybe help you see it, if we say display grayscale mask, also Alt-M is your shortcut. Then white is the masked areas, black is the unmasked areas. So you can see the white areas, that's just the darkest blacks basically. So now if I go back into Luma range, you can see how this works, maybe a bit clearer. So I just want to isolate the darkest blacks. Now radius and sensitivity, these control how the edges work basically. Now with radius at 0, nothing's going to happen. The sensitivity slider is in fact deactivated if the radius is at 0. So if I go up to somewhere in the middle and put the sensitivity at 0, you can see the edges are really soft and fluffy. So that's a good way to sort of feather the edges. If I go sensitivity all the way to 100, it's going to follow the edges really tightly. And you can see even on like the tire and, you know, the girl's clothes here that it's really picked up on those edges. But I'm going to soften this up to some extent like so. So sometimes you might want to wrap a mask tightly around something. Sometimes you might want to make it softer. So I'm going to say apply, press M to get rid of my mask. Now, why did I go through this process of making this weird mask? Because what I want to do is just darken those darkest blacks. Kind of like a contrast adjustment, but I'm just going to pull in the levels on this layer. And you should always name your layers. Darkest blacks. I know it's luminosity because it's got a little sun. So I'm going to pull this in, and then that's just going to, if I do it dramatically, see it's darkening those blacks. I don't want it to look like that. I just want to pull it in a little bit just to give us a bit of darkness like so. Almost final layer, I'm going to make another Raphael, new filled layer like so. If we press M, you can see the mask again like so. And before I do anything, I'm going to put this opacity down to around 70%. Why? You'll find out in a minute, but it's going to give me some flexibility a bit later on. So now I'm going to go to my color tool tab, and we're going to find the color balance tool like so. And this is dead simple to use. We've got 3 wheels, shadows, midtones, highlights, or tabs with the wheels on their own, so they're a bit bigger. Or you can always drag this out and you can make it, if I find the edge, you can make it larger like so. So now we've got, did I accidentally just draw a radial mask on this layer? No, that's good. I thought I did. So now we've got our color balance tool a bit bigger. So, and it's dead easy. You pick up the center point and think, okay, I want to have whatever colored shadows. So I want to have colder shadows like so. So the further I pull it to the edge, the colder it gets like so. So I'm going to go around here, and I want to warm up my midtones a tiny bit. And also maybe, do I want to warm up the highlights? No, I'm going to leave the highlights as they are, maybe down here somewhere. Now I can also use the right hand sliders to moderate the contrast a bit. So if you wanted to darken down the shadows or lift them up, you could also use those as well. But I'm going to leave those as is just for the color grading. So let's put color balance back. Now, if you remember, I said I started off at 70%, so my color grading is only having 70% effect on the image. So if I want to make it stronger, I can go in this direction. If I want to make it weaker, then I can go in this direction or anywhere in between. So I probably settled for a color grade around something like that. So I'm pretty happy with that. Alan says, does clicking Luma Range also fill the mask? No, it doesn't. Just because you click Luma Range doesn't fill it at all. So, and the reason for that is that you might like to apply a Luma Range on a mask that you've already drawn. So I could apply a Luma Range to this radial mask if I wanted it to. So by clicking Luma, I wouldn't want it to then go and fill my radial mask, for example. So you have to start with a mask. Ed says, would you recommend starting at 70% for all layer adjustments? It's not bad. Like if you're dodging and burning, it gives you that flexibility of deciding which way to go with your color grading or so on and so forth. So yeah, it could be not a bad thing to do. And Ed, you also wanted to talk about the keystone tool. So let's say, I don't know if it'll work on this image, but this door isn't perfectly square. But if I click on this cursor tool here, and I just basically align where this door should be to be upright. So it's there. I'm just pulling these little orange circles. So it's there and it's roughly like that. So that's describing the error. Now if I say apply, then it should correct it like so. So that's all you do. You just align those to either side. So in this case, you might decide that you want to do it. We can also do horizontal or a combination of the two. So if I put this guy here, I can't see the bottom of the door, so I might make this horribly wrong, but I guess the bottom of the door is like that. Say apply, and then you see it straightens it up like so. Actually worked quite nicely. Good job, Ed. Good suggestion. All right, so I think that image is finished. Of course, if I want to go back and adjust anything else, I might just make my vignette a bit darker like so. Once again, if I hold my Alt key down and click, that's before. So no adjustments, and then after, like so. So a bit more of an extensive edit, but one that I actually quite enjoy doing. Stephen says, how did you rotate the radial mask? So if we just pick up this. So you see if I hover on the middle line, then you can see my cursor is here. So if you hover on the middle line, you can then just click and drag, rotate, like so. So that's all you need to do. Just hover on the middle line, like so. Is there a list of shortcuts? Yes, Richard. So if you go to Edit Keyboard Shortcuts, you can search for a shortcut. So if I wanted to know how to add a filled layer, I could type layer and I could make a shortcut. It's empty right now to add a layer. If you want to see a summary, you just click summarize and that will open a web page and show you all the shortcuts for your particular shortcut set. So that shows you everything. Alrighty. Is it possible to set the default layer to 70? No, but it might be quite a nice default, but it's not possible, I'm afraid. Sorry about that. All right, how are we doing for time? Just having a look. Good. We are in good time. So we did our landscape, we did Camilla, we did Indian street scene. Now we have this one, which I'm going to make a new variant of this one. Let's just rotate it like so. So this is actually a really good example of using the, hang on, I'll just hop on again. This is a really good example of using the color editor. Most of what we're going to edit on this is just using the color editor and layers as well. And really, any tool in Capture One gets exponentially more awesome as soon as you try and combine it into a layer somehow, because it gives you that flexibility, like with the opacity and also with the masking that we're going to have a look at as well. So this guy is definitely interesting. So let's zoom in a little bit. Base corrections, let's just do a bit of contrast, and levels are fine. I don't want to move my black and white points in because it's going to start to clip. So let's just leave it at that. So let's go to our color editor. I'll just move it up a bit. And I'm using the advanced color editor. If you have the ability to go advanced, I would always recommend that you do so. There's just a lot more options than basic. And the whole point of the advanced color editor is that you can either have very narrow color selections, so very specific, picking out very specific colors, or you can have much broader ones as well. So now if I wanted to, let's say, grab this picker here, and I'm going to pick on the orange like so, you can see now in the color editor tool, Capture One has given me a suggested color range, but it's only a suggestion. So what does that suggestion actually look like? It's very hard to tell unless you have super duper color vision. So if I turn on view selected color range down here, you can see everything that turns to monochrome is not part of the color selection. So in this case, we've pretty much just picked out the orange, but there's also a bit of green sneaking in over here as well. So now I can choose to make my range bigger or smaller. So let's bring this out actually so it's a bit larger, probably easier to see, like so. So now if you imagine going around the circle, that's color range. So I could say, well, let's have the reds in there as well. And you see the seeds pop in, like so. And if we go this way, we can probably cut out, see the greens are starting to creep in if we look here. And if I grab the edge boundary and we go this way, we can start to cut the greens out. But I got to be careful, I don't want to get rid of the oranges too. So I can do something like that. Incidentally, to change this boundary, all that's happening is you're grabbing the edge of that wedge with the mouse or pen in this case. Sometimes on the webinar transmission, the cursor kind of whizzes over to somewhere else, but you won't see that on the recording. It's just in case you're confused on the transmission. So we're just changing that range by squeezing it down to the left and right. Saturation range is in this direction. So that would be making this, cutting out the less saturated colors. And you can see if I squeeze that right up, we start to miss a few bits around here. If I open that right out, then we get all of our orange like so. And if I compress it this way, can't see, we can actually see very slightly we're losing a bit of the red like so. Now the fuzziness, come here. Now the fuzziness around the outside relates to the first slider, which is the smoothness slider. So that basically means the roll off into the neighboring colors. So if I drop smoothness right down to 0, then you see we start to lose some of the smaller ones. If I bring it up, then we get a nice roll off and we don't get any missing colors like so. So this selection is a pretty good selection of oranges and reds. If I go in this direction, then we kind of limit the reds, and we could technically go all the way around and have it as big as possible. But I just want the orange and reds like so. Now, let's drop the color editor back over here so we can see, whoops, I did another click. So we can see what we're doing. Turn off view selected color range, and now I can play with hue, saturation, and lightness. So if I want to, let's just make it a bit brighter, or maybe not. Let's make it a bit darker, and then a bit more saturated. And hue wise, that walks us either round the wheel, and I don't think we need to touch that. So that's a very super simple color edit. So we can do more. We can do up to 30 different picks. So let's say, okay, I want to change the greens a little bit. So I'll grab my picker, click on the green, turn on view selected color range. This time I want to get away from the oranges. So I'm going to compress it down this way. And then that way we get pretty good selection of the greens. And then I could go on and think, well, let's just change the hue a little bit and brighten and so on. However, you see, if I change this dramatically, we're also affecting the greens outside of the stuff on the plate. Now, no amount of tweaking of what I do with this range is going to make any difference because green is green. So even if I make this very restrictive, I'm still going to be affecting the greens over here, for example. So let's get rid of that color selection. That was clicking on minus. And let's go up to layers. I'm just going to, because I'm working on a small screen here, I'm just going to remove some tools so we can have everything open at the same time. Let's do that. So we've got layers and color editor. So I'm going to make a new layer. Going to grab a brush, just zoom out slightly. Not that much. Whoa, not that much. Somewhere in between. There we go. Zoom out slightly, right click. We need full flow. Going to make my brush a bit bigger and a bit harder, and I'm just going to paint a mask just roughly on the plate, making sure I get all the green stuff. Now this does in no way have to be accurate, just has to cover the greens. So it can be a bit messy like that. So mask, and I do the same as before. Grab my picker, click on the greens, turn on view selected color range. Now view selected color range doesn't pay any attention to the mask, so it's going to affect the whole image. But I want to come away from my oranges, like so. Take the smoothness down a bit. Turn off view selected color range, and then now I can change my hue. If I just do something dramatic, you see it's only affecting the greens on the plate, like so. So I might just want to lighten those leaves up a tiny bit and just change the hue ever so slightly, not by much, like so. So that just really allows me to make the color editor even more restrictive by working on it with a layer. Now let's go back to my background and my first color pick. If you remember, that was just the oranges and reds. But let's say, you know what, I want to sharpen these up a bit or change the contrast. I've run out of options in the color editor to do that. But what I can do is click on the color editor and say, create mask layer from selection. So that will essentially look at my color range and transform that into a mask. So if I do that now, create mask layer from selection, takes a few seconds. If you watch in the layers tool, we've now got layer 2. So if I do the same trick as before, let's just zoom out and I turn on my grayscale mask, then you see we've got that. So white is the mask, black is not the mask, but it's editable or editable. So I can erase the bits of the mask I don't need. So I just make my brush a bit bigger and I get rid of these bits because I just want the stuff on the plate. So I just do a quick bit of cleanup like so. Job done. Press M to get that back. Now if we zoom in, see that's the mask I'm left with, just the oranges and the reds. So now what I could do, if I go to clarity, we could throw a bit of clarity in there so they pop a bit more, chuck a bit of structure in there so it sharpens up a bit. We could add some contrast, not that much. But you see what I mean. We're now just editing those little bits and bobs on the plate. Last thing to do, I'm going to do one more layer. Grab my brush. Let's just zoom out a tiny bit. And I'm just going to do a mask on the plate. Again, it's going to be pretty rough, like so. Because the plate has got a bit of a bluish tint to it, which I want to get rid of. So I'm going to go back into my color editor again, pick the plate around there. See, it's fairly sort of low on the saturation scale. The little dot, which you probably can't see, which is right tucked in the middle, that's where I clicked. But I want to make sure all the blues in that range are going to get desaturated. So now if I saturate fully, you can see the difference. And then if I desaturate, that just knocks the blue out of that plate. So there we go. So if I zoom back out, or let's zoom in actually so we can see what we did. So if I hold my Alt key down and click on the reset icon, that was before and then after, like so. So it just goes to show how brilliant the color editor is, and even better when you throw in some layered edits as well. PG says, could we lock an image with adjustments to avoid any further modifications? No. Who don't you trust, PG? Yourself or someone else? No, you can't lock an image. You might be able to lock it in the Finder or Windows Explorer and make it unwritable, but I don't think that wouldn't change anything in Capture One because we don't actually change the raw data. So Alan says the selected color range does not respect the layer. Correct. So even like on which layer, see, you're supposed to name your layers, David, so you know what's what. So yeah, even on layers like this, for example, if I turn on view selected color range, the layer is not respected. So just to be aware of that. Is there a list of symbols that show us things like luminosity mask? No, there isn't. So luminosity mask is the sunshine, and then we had, where's our image? India. The radial mask, you don't get anything. I think it's only the luminosity one. If you change to a clone and heal, you get those two little symbols as well. So that's all there is for layers, really. So there isn't a huge amount going on for those. Oh, there was an earlier question. What's the difference between clone and what was it? New variant and clone variant. Clone variant makes a virtual copy of the image with all the current adjustments on that image. New variant just makes a virtual copy with no adjustments. So it depends what you want to do. Okay. And Keith says, what can you use if you want a more selective mask than the brush can give you? You will need to use refine mask for that, which is probably a bit out of the scope for today. But if you watch some of the tutorials on our Learning Hub, then you'll be able to see that. So refine mask is what you're looking for. So if you right click, you can say refine, and that will basically help you snap to edges if you need to do that. Works really well. Super powerful. All right, last image, and there's a bit of a backstory to this one. We've got a basic headshot here. This is a friend of mine. He was round a couple of weekends ago. Said, I desperately need a new shot for work and for LinkedIn and all that kind of stuff. What can you do? I said, not a lot, Chris, because it's raining. And this is my studio, basically. So we shot this outside in the drizzle with a pop-up background. So very basic and Heath Robinson. Plonk Chris on a chair, and we came up with this. Now, the purpose of showing you this edit is basically to show what's possible with like a round trip to Photoshop. So if you need to combine some tools which aren't available in Capture One and get the best of both worlds, whether it's Photoshop or Affinity Photos, something like that, then it's easily doable. So this is the shot out of camera, I think. Yes. So no adjustments so far. Doesn't need a great deal, but because of less consistent light, let's just open up the shadows a little bit. Could have a tiny bit of contrast. Always nice, and a tiny bit of clarity, but not too much. I'll do the same trick that we did with our editorial shot. So I'm going to make a new layer and call that L for lighten, because it's just a little bit dark on this side. So I'll bump up exposure. Now it doesn't have to be exposure. You could use exposure, you could use shadow lift, you could use curves, you could all do all kinds of things. Now if you want to kind of anticipate better what your adjustment's going to do, you can actually start with a new filled layer. So that's going to be a layer over the whole image. So in this case, I want to lighten up this right hand side of the face. So does exposure work? It does. Should I do exposure and a bit of shadow fill? Doesn't have much effect. If I look at curve and put my cursor on where I want to lighten, it's showing me, okay, it's a mid-tone because of that orange line. So what I could do is then bump up the curve, which is working quite nicely. So by filling the layer, you can kind of anticipate what the edit's going to do. Now, once you're happy with the edit, you can just right click and say clear mask. But if you watch the curve, you'll see my curve is intact. It's just cleared the mask. So now I can brush that in where I want. Remember, nice low flow, nice soft brush. So I'm just going to brighten up this side a little bit, for example. Maybe just down here. I'm probably going to crop that out anyway, but just to sort of lighten up this bit. Now if I turn, let's get the left eye a bit as well, just to lighten up. Now if I turn the layer off, so that's before and after, like so. Never know it was there, just lifts the exposure a tiny bit. I think I need to crop, but first of all I just want to rotate a little bit. So I like to just shift click and just nudge it basically till I think it's about right. Now press C on my keyboard or choose my crop cursor tool up here, and let's just make this a slightly tighter crop, something like this. So that's good for me. So that's, a good base start point for our edits. I think I might just need to do a little bit, just lighten that side a bit. So what if we want to go into Photoshop and do a bit more like retouch and so on? Yes, we could do some basic retouching in Capture One, but if my friend here had, flowing long blonde hair or dark hair, then we might want to get rid of some flyaway hairs and all that kind of stuff. And that's probably easier in a pixel editor like Photoshop or Affinity Photo. So what we can do is I'm going to right click on this and say Edit With and choose Photoshop. Now a dialog's going to pop up where we can choose our basic format like PSD, TIFF and so on and so forth. So let's say edit like so. Now this will create my PSD file and open it up into Photoshop like so. And if you see in too fast. If you see in Capture One, there's my PSD file, which is now alongside my original. So now we're in Photoshop. I'm not a good retoucher. So what we're going to do is, we're going to make a new layer and we're going to call this retouch. And let's just do some basic stuff that we want to do. So I'm very rusty in Photoshop. So let's just see, told you, need to option click, right click to get it bigger. And then we're just going to do some basic retouch like so. Let's get the patch tool here and just do the kind of stuff that you would do in these things. Get rid of some flyaway hairs and so on, like so. Oh, a little bit there as well. Okay, so we've done our basic whatever we want to do in Photoshop. So now I can leave my layer there intact. So my retouch layer is there intact. I'm going to save this. Maximize compatibility is on, and we'll say OK. So that's saved. If I go back to Capture One and look at the PSD file, you see the little retouch I did has now disappeared, like so. So what if we want to give my friend some options? Say, well, here's your color image. Maybe you'd like to have a black and white. So I'm working on the PSD file. So let's say image and say new variant. So this will give me a virtual copy of the PSD file, which I can also work on in Capture One. So now I could say, well, let's convert to black and white. Let's just add my black and white tool back. Enable black and white. Let's brighten the reds and yellows a bit so the skin isn't too muddy. Like so. We could also do a little extra bit of contrast and so on. So now we've got our color version and we've got our black and white version. But what if I missed some retouching? What could we do? So there's a little stray eyebrow there or something. So now if I right click and say open with, not edit, open with. So edit will always make an additional file like a PSD and so on. Open will simply open the image into my application of choice. So I'm going to open this back into Photoshop. And here it is. I'll just make sure that was the one. Let's right click, open with. Just seemed incredibly fast. There we go. So there's my shot opened up. Still got my retouch layer. So I could do some additional retouching or whatever I want to do. So, whoops, wrong tool, David. So let's just fill in a bit here. We could also try, now you're going to really laugh at my retouching abilities. So let's try a fix here, for example, and then we say fade healing brush. So just so it's slightly more believable than what I just did. Option click and whoops, told you I was bad at this. Remember, I'm the Capture One person, not the Photoshop person, like so. And let's say fade healing brush, you get the idea. So like so, and say OK. So I've done a bit more retouching. Now if I save this, let's go back to Capture One quickly. Now you might have been too quick, but now my PSD is updated and my color one, and so my black and white one is as well. So really handy. So if I do something obvious, like let's grab a pencil and just draw, like, and now say save, go back to Capture One, like so. So that's on the black and white and the color. Now if I go back to Photoshop, let's undo that and save it again, and back to Capture One, it will update. Now of course, now I've got the color and black and white, I can then simply go to my process recipes and output them in suitable sizes for, you know, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, however my friend wants to use it, and so on. And then it just saves me a bit of extra time because I can batch output everything that I need to do. I could just tick on the various process recipes that I wanted, and away I go. So if you run out of options in Capture One, then it's easy to just flip-flop between an application like Photoshop or Affinity Photo, for example. How are we doing for time? Oh, pretty good. Okay, so let's take the last questions. Let's see. PSD versus TIFF. Oh, you're probably asking the wrong guy. I think that's probably a job for Google. PSD and TIFF, not a great deal of difference. You could still work with layers in what I just did. So I think for most of us, there's probably not much to shout about. So Stefan says, so the second PSD is linked to the first. Well, it's the same one. This is where it's a bit of a head scratch for you because there's only one PSD file, but Capture One, like it can do with raw files, we've got virtual copies. So let's say on the black and white, let's say we want to make let's go for another variant like so. And then on this one, we could say, well, let's do a bit of film grain, for example, like so. Because there's no reason why we can't add a bit of whatever, whack in a bit of grain as well, like so. So now we've got our color, we've got our black and white, and we've got our black and white with film grain. But it's all the same PSD file, it's just Capture One is storing a different set of instructions for it on each one. But if I do any retouch on any of them, then it always comes across on all of those variants. And now, of course, again, when I export for those, for JPEGs, TIFFs, different use, then it's one action. So it can save lots of time. Oh yeah, that's a good point from Sebastian. Annotation. So if you do annotations in Capture One, which where you can draw on the image and write notes and things, we can save them as a layer in a PSD file, but not on a TIFF file. So there's some simple ones like that. Vishwanath, sorry if I said your name wrong. If I apply a mask on TIFF that was saved via Photoshop, when I open Capture One after some layer adjustments in Capture One, the layers get cleared. I don't know whether you mean the Photoshop layers or the Capture One layers. There was a bug in version 12 where some layer masks could get lost, but that was fixed in 12.01. So do update if you need to, and that should fix you. But remember, the layers in Photoshop you can't see in Capture One. So like my Photoshop retouch layer, you can't see, for example. Okay, last couple of questions. Does Edit With work the same with other outside programs? It does to some extent. I would just warn you that in this case, when you say Edit With, you'll get the image returned back to Capture One. Now with Photoshop, so if I just open this one in Photoshop and I do this squiggle again and save it back, then you see the preview updates automatically. If you find that your preview isn't updating, just say Image, Regenerate Preview. So that will just check the TIFF file or whatever it is and regenerate it. So you might find if it's not Photoshop, it's not automated. So for some reason, all these various different companies write files or close them up in different ways, unbelievably. So this is, of course, optimized for Photoshop as that's the most popular. So just bear in mind, you might have to regen your previews. Let's see. Last question. Stefan says, will I talk about the normalize tool? Probably not today because I don't have the right images here. But I will do a tutorial on it soon. So just hang around for that. Normalize tool basically will make a bunch of images look the same by changing the white balance and exposure. Okay, but there will be a tutorial coming. Don't worry. Okay, last question. Let's see. I think we've pretty much covered all the ones I can answer. I can't answer anything about future plans because that's all super secret. But if you do have any features, functionality that you want to request, just make a support case. Say, I'd really love in Capture One to see XYZ, and then it gets logged. So that's really the best way to do it. Alrighty, okay, so that's enough waffle from me, I think. Just to let you know that next week is another popular one, the Color Editor Masterclass. So that's really a whole, is it possible? A whole webinar on just using the Color Editor. So you saw a glimpse today with the food image, but we're just going to a bit more detail. And have some more examples of going over just what the color editor is good for. If you're coming from Lightroom, it's probably especially useful to watch because the way the color adjustments work in Lightroom is quite different to Capture One. So we can talk a little bit about that as well. The recording will go up tomorrow at some point on YouTube and our Learning Hub. So don't forget, I'm going to paste it in the chat window. learn.phase1.com. That's where you can find everything that we put on YouTube, but it's categorized. So you can search by your skill level, by subject, by length of tutorial, all kinds of stuff. So make sure you have a look on that as well. learn.phase1.com. Alrighty, many thanks for your time today. Look out for the recording. When you exit, please answer the survey. And we hope to see you all again soon. So take care and have a great weekend. See you soon. Bye.